no depths to which we will not sink in this time war.
The more observant among you might have noticed in our hike back through Doctor Who mythology, we've actually missed one incarnation, and he's a favourite of mine. No, not Scream the Shouker, no. I'm talking the War Doctor, the late John Hurt. Ooh, and this Doctor do hurt. Get ready to see this pop culture icon on his worst day, at his most vulnerable. In stories and situations we have only heard myths of. Sounds like you're gonna need a top tier actor for that, as well as a lot of ballsy experimental storytelling. Can you tell a convincing story that captures the scale of this conflict? Or does actually realising the world take away from the mythos? This is a question all these stories have had to contend with. Can I tell a good contained story whilst also embellishing the spectacle? Me, I was always gonna love the Time War. Two high concept armies scouring the Doctor Who universe for resources. Natural wonders, weapons, calamities. It's Armageddon Day on a scale you cannot comprehend. Can you do justice to a throwaway ominous reference like the Nightmare Child or an army of never-wers? Or should the myth just remain that way? It's very interesting ground, but I'm obviously biased. I'm gonna say yes, because this is a childhood fantasy brought to life for my adult sensibilities. In theory, these could be some of the biggest successes or failures of the franchise. Let's explore some of them today. The War Doctor, it may not surprise you to learn though, does not have an abundance of stories. This was originally intended to be a short video to tide you over to the next large installment, but the Time War is big. And in terms of reach, I think I underestimated it. This Russell T Davies new series concept spread so far back into the show's mythology, it's unreal. Genesis of the Daleks is the first inciting incident of the conflict. The Seventh Doctor knows it's coming. Even the First Doctor, the first one, was intercepted by Daleks from the Time War. Time War, more like retcon war. Now, suddenly every story from Apocalypse Element to Remembrance, Dark Eyes to the Gallifrey series. By recontextualizing classic stories, most of Doctor Who's history has been leading to this. An event that has preoccupied 5 different Doctors and has only really just been resolved. Fun fact, every season finale of Russell T Davies' run involved a villain who had escaped the Time War. Every single one of them. And it's dominated so much of the show's identity at this point that I think it's just worse off without it. To date, the Doctor role has never been played by a bad actor or actress. But the late John Hurt was in another league of his own. There's a reason he was a commander of the British Empire. The David Lynch called him the greatest actor in the world. And he still has the professionalism and the humility to bring his A-game to an audio Doctor Who sci-fi fantasy series, making him one of my favourite human beings ever. In just one episode, with a handful of lines and sharing a screen with 2 of the most beloved characters in the series, John Hurt still finishes a character arc that we never even knew about. And seeing key decisions in his life, seeing him get to this stage, is a privilege. Thankfully, in some of the final performances he ever gave, there is now enough John Hurt War Doctor material to fill a series. The War Doctor has about as much screen time as Eccleston at this point. Of all of the mediums to tell the Time War story with, I really think prose and audio are the only 2 viable options. Nevertheless, whether it hits high or it sinks low, this is some gutsy storytelling. Here are 5 of the worst. Day of the Vashta Narada. The Time War rages as the High Council commissions the genetic modification of Vashta Narada. Right out the gate, cool villain to bring back, but the classic Doctors box set decides to give them 2 whole stories, when it turns out they can actually barely fill 1. The 4th Doctor counterpart manages to get by via treading the same beats of the TV show. It's good, it's a modest story. Dark Eyes writer Matt Fitton instead attempts to give this villain legs, to see if they can offer more than their central gimmick. The answer just sadly seems to be no. Matt Fitton's name is going to come up a bunch in this, both for good and bad, but here he seems to have just rewritten Jurassic Park. Yeah, this story borrows so generously from the Crichton Spielberg masterpieces that it doesn't even feel that endearing. There's a thin line between pastiche and plagiarism. I know that. One of my favourites is Brain and Morbius. But the Doctor actually quoting Jeff Goldblum whilst walking through the plot of the story, that's too blatant for me. Don't mess with animal nature is also a very weird message to offer when reality is getting messed with in the background. For me, the best Time War stories offer a mental challenge, a moral trial, rather than just a physical one. And in this one, the Doctor and Alystra have to survive the monster attack. Also, they fixed the gimmick villain by just giving them more gimmicks. There's a giant one, there's the Nashta Varada, and ones that get you in the light. And mate, this is all just hats on hats. But McGann's good, the comedy's tight, and an attempt was made. Plus, I also seem to be in a minority on this one. Give it a listen. Number 2, A Thing of Guile. A chained Doctor has finally become the Council's dog, as a trapped squadron investigate the latest Dalek experiment. This is a good introduction to Cardinal Alystra. Beautifully played by the late Jacqueline Pearce, the Cardinal is one of the constants of the Time War stories. Every bit a threat as much as an ally, she has such presence that she's honestly like the main villain of the Time War itself. The Daleks may be Voldemort, but she's Umbridge. But sometimes, due to overexposure, the character just does not work. Alystra, just like in the last story, just dominates a whole story on this box set, which she can't really carry as the main villain because we already know her. Their dynamic by this point feels one note. The Cardinal wants the Doctor on a leash. The Doctor does not want to be on a leash. It's the second box set, and the War Doctor has already been deemed a traitor. Yeah, if you were excited to see the Doctor fighting on the front lines, committing atrocities, you might be disappointed with his run, as Alystra and the writers have already written him off as the same anti-soldier, conscientious objector, Ronin as ever. Plot-wise, there's some Daleks in the background, rehashing Daleks in Manhattan, of all things, but I tend to forget they're even there during the runtime. There's a really likeable cast, and I like hearing these characters interact, but it's a major slowdown on the box set. A big bump that adversely hurts the stories on either side of it. We know the Doctor will escape his leash, and we probably know just how he'll do it and just what he'll say, making this whole side story feel like a temporary fix. Easily the weakest episode for the War Doctor. Number 3, in the Garden of Death. The Doctor and his allies are missing their memories, and question why they're being held captive on a Dalek prison camp. This is just a middling story that throws the audience right into the deep end. I've always liked stories that unfold in an unchronological order. The situation is explained in narrative reverse, but when 8 has amnesia again, and the explanation is so rudimentary and underwhelming, it rather all falls flat. There's great moments for Bliss and the 11, who is a totally humanized villain, but just rule the Doctor out of his own story, why don't you? Why would the Daleks have a gardening planet? Why does the Doctor do nothing to resolve the plot? This story is a slow breather on a box set that isn't that action-packed to begin with. Number 4, All Hands on Deck. You see me bash the show, the books, the audios, the games. Now watch Sam dunk on a short story. Hell, I think my problems with the story are longer than the story itself. In All Hands on Deck, the 8th Doctor flees the Time War and is reunited with Susan, who has just been summoned to return to the High Council on Gallifrey. This is a very functional story. It's got a purpose. It's mechanical. It's here to explain where Susan Foreman is in the Time War and in the new series. And honestly, it's a shame that a story had to fill the gap between Susan and the Time War to begin with. It's a cannon plaster. It's a sick note excuse of a story. And the thing is, I like the contents. It's a good Susan story, but it's a story that feels like a realised fan headcanon. Perhaps I'll just never be the audience for a lore transition story, but everything I could get out of this tale, I could experience on a fan wiki page. That said, I still recommend it. It's great prose with a clear understanding of Susan's character, and anyone who manages to secure a short trip has my respect as a writer. I just wish Susan didn't have to be forcibly ejected from the show. Again. And number 5, the conscript. Somebody temporarily locks up the Doc and tries to teach him military authority. How do you think it goes? Oh, my favourite moment in this confused story? The Doctor's given a white lotus of cowardice. but then it just has no bearing on him whatsoever. Much like the story, trying to guilt a character like the Doctor for not resorting to war is just a waste of time. If you had a very different protagonist who wasn't defined by their pacifism, and is struggling with their sense of duty versus their sense of decency, then yeah, you'd have a cliché entry-level war story. But the Doctor is already so set in stone with his moral code. It's like trying to change Batman. It's not going to happen on this audio box set, making this whole story a waste of time, a diversion. But pay no mind to them, honestly. When you say the 2 words, Cosmic War, you have my full attention. Here are the 5 best. Echoes of War! The Doctor, a Dalek, and a ship of refugees crash on a jungle planet. With time itself corrupting and their new friend Dahl's memory coming back, can they all work together to get to safety? So, first of all, amazing pitch. The scenario of this one, with a good Dalek, makes for one of the most memorable, iconic, and tense plots in recent history. Briggs clearly has so much fun playing a confused, ticking time bomb of a Dalek. Sometimes Dahl was friendly, vulnerable, cute. He's looking for answers, and I love him. Like a dog. There's a good number of stories that just isolate one Dalek as the threat, and I don't think any of them pull it off quite as tantalisingly as Fitton does here. This is a good, engaging bit of storytelling. A clear, defined objective. A paranoid, small cast, and their tensions becoming the story's tensions. It's also a real man versus environment type story. The type that Doctor Who does oh so rarely. The constantly evolving, devolving landscape is incredibly vivid for an audio drama, and it reminds me of another great Time War story, The Never When. Just 2 stories that really show the ramifications of bastardizing time. This one also has perhaps the best Doctor Who plot twist of all time, but no more on that from me. Echoes of War is a 10 out of 10 story, packaged alongside a bit of a mixed bag, but if the experience is so good, I'd buy it just for this one story alone. Number 2, Only the Monstrous. So, not only did that mad lad Nick Briggs manage to bag the rights to the Time War, and Golden Globe national darling John Hurt, but then he also felt compelled to write a Doctor Who blockbuster. A space epic. Scale doesn't even do this box set justice. Let's talk about John Hurt. This grumpy, nomadic, defeatist Doctor gets a whole meditative first story just to sit around, fish, refuse to go back to the battlefield. And it's a great look into his heart, to his tortured little soul, that I truly believe only John Hurt could have delivered. Hurt's incarnation is poetic. He's short, he doesn't suffer fools, and anything that isn't helpful is going to get dismissed. There's simply no time for jokes or flair or showing off, but the warmth and soul of the Doctor is always on this character's sleeves. He's the embodiment of a battered jacket. But it's important to note that as much as this incarnation goes on about his evil deeds, we can only assume these were done off screen. Hurt's defining trait is the fact that this Doctor beats himself up. To refer back to this little gem, Moffat tells us there was no big elixir that made the War Doctor some warrior. In fact, it was hinted it was just lemonade, making John Hurt's incarnation a Doctor like any other, just one with all of his collected self-hatred manifest. It's why I love Day of the Doctor. For us, it's his first appearance, but it's his deathbed. In his last ever chronological appearance, this Doctor finally gets to explore his own personality. This story is a rescue operation turned assassination mission that once it gets started, does not let up. I didn't want it to end. A 3-disc, 3-hour epic, and I was on the edge of my seat throughout. That's impressive. Also, the Daleks' plan to throw 1,000 literal physical planets at their enemy is inspired. It's so ridiculous, it's brilliant. Number 3, the Sontaran Ordeal. Disconnected from the greater events of the war, Ordeal plays out as a normal Sontaran story, until the ramifications of the war catch up with the Doctor. Sarana Teal is an exceptional one-time companion. And how often can you say that? Smartly, she's made the crux of the story, this passive outsider, who is trying to discern the real villain, Sontarans or Time Lords. Within the Time War, the Sontarans really don't amount to much at all. And the story uses that. As ever, villains are best explored by isolating one and focusing on character first and foremost. Thankfully, the audios are very good at this. It's refreshing to hear Dan Starkey allowed to do a deep, interesting performance. You'll find no Straxisms here. Ordeal has amazing replay value, and I just also happen to have a major soft spot for good guy Sontarans. Number 4, Beneath the DISCOJD. Hey, have you guys heard this theme? How do you match the presence, the sheer charm of John Hurt? Well, you cast an equally influential British actor. So Derek Jacobi was born to play the Master, and it's a huge shame they never got to meet. This is a dark man. Fans of the Master character might want to prepare for having a new favourite version, because this is the performance that combines the pathetic and desperate survivor with the deranged evil streak. Although he might be embracing the Doctor mold in this story, doubtful listeners will get punished for thinking he operates in the same way. There's quite a few aquatic stories in the Time War, and there's also been a number of stories where the Master pretends to impersonate the Doctor. But this is really the best of all of them. Fantastic, depraved, bone-chilling story. And number 5, a tie between my favourite Doctor Who book ever and my favourite Doctor Who short story. Engines of War and The Third Wise Man share a spot because they are the perfect depiction of what a cosmic war should be. Reading these huge battles, yeah, we're actually in the frontline battles in this stories, reads like a Lovecraftian nightmare. Every sentence just falls apart into incomprehensible dread, but with very accessible stakes, characters, and plots. These aren't just stories happening within the war, these are the Time War's defining moments. The Third Wise Man features the Nightmare Child and shows the demise of Davros, whilst the Engines of War sees the Doctor go up against the Dalek Council and Rassilon himself. With a climax that pushes him so far, he decides to end it once and for all. Saying anything about these stories will spoil them, but you can find this one here, or an audiobook, and you can find The Third Wise Man in this collection. Yeah, it's really well hidden. What can I say? I did my reading, I did my homework for this colossal video. So anyway, here's a 5-hour TED Talk for why Engines of War is the greatest Doctor Who story of all time. I'm just kidding, I'll spare you. This video's long enough. The Time War feels like a culmination of every war. It feels like the natural end point of conflict. I hope I'm the first to notice this, but the bureaucratic Time Lords and the genocidal Daleks really come across as the battle between far left and far right extremes. The late point of our own world's political systems. There's stories where the Daleks commit atrocities and other stories where the Time Lords are the main villains. But the best story of all combines both of them. They both became terrors that had to be removed. Except for the fact that neither of them were. And literally everybody and their dad escaped the war anyway. Wow, well that was all for nothing.